I gavel this session to order. If you don't maintain decorum, I will call the Sergeant at Arms. Good evening. Welcome in out of this wonderful, blustery, cold, moist weather out there. God bless you for your faithfulness. And next Wednesday is going to be 70 degrees. So I like to share good news. Yeah. The weatherman says. I should preface it. So. That's true. We had a weatherman in West Virginia, small town, weather guy. And he was wrong every week. And he was awful. Everybody loved him, though, but he was awful. Okay, we are studying in Acts chapter 20 this evening. Let's ask God's blessings. Holy Father, we bow before you. We're grateful for your goodness and your care for us. We thank you that you've brought us safely here tonight, and you'll bless our time. These few minutes we have together in your word, that we will learn those things that you would have us learn, and learn how better to serve you and be more like your Son. Thank you for your love in Christ. We pray in his name. Amen. Okay. Acts chapter 20 begins after the uproar ceased. Opening words. What uproar is Luke referring to at the beginning of Acts 20? After the uproar ceased. There he goes, asking. What's that? The riot at Ephesus. Remember the big riot in the big theater that took place there that the last part of Acts 19 talked about? So after that ceased is where Luke sets the events here in chapter 20. And it says that Paul sent for the disciples. That would be, they're still in Ephesus, okay? Now there's going to be a lot of place names here in the next several verses. You might want to have one of the maps of Missionary Journey number 3 in front of you. It's easy to get lost in all the names. There's a lot of people names too here in the first several verses. But he's still in Ephesus, which is on the edge of Asia Minor on the coast. And he sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. So if you're thinking of your map, the coast, the west coast of Asia Minor, Ephesus, and then he's going to go to Greece, northern Greece, Macedonia. That's the plan. And he left for there, and it said when he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. Now Macedonia is Greece. It's northern Greece, but here when Luke says Greece, it seems like he's talking about the southern part, which sometimes he calls Achaia. That's down where Corinth and Athens is in the south. But sometimes he just says Greece. So he's traveling back through Greece in these opening verses. And it says when he got there, when he came to Greece, that's down probably Corinth, okay? He spent 3 months, according to verse 3. And when a plot was made against him by the Jews as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. So if you can either look at a map or sort of picture it in your mind, Ephesus, and it goes to Greece, all the way down to Corinth. And his plan seems to be he's going to leave there and sail to Syria. That's, north of Israel. So we're going to sail across the Mediterranean, because eventually he's going to get back to Israel, right? So to leave from Corinth and go all the way across, that's not going to happen that way, because he finds out that there's a plot against him. So there's an assassination plot against Paul from the Jews, a group of Jews. And so he decides, instead of sailing across the Mediterranean to Israel, that he'll go back up through Greece. He'll go back up to Macedonia for the time being. So if you look at a map of the third missionary journey, it'll usually have a line going down and then maybe a broken line going back up. He's sort of retracing his steps. That's what's going on here. And it's all covered in this, 2 or 3 verses by Luke. We've got a period of time here that this is taking place over. Luke makes it sound like it's just like that. But there is this plot against, this isn't the last time we'll hear of a plot against Paul's life. There'll be one later in the book. So they're trying to kill Paul. His enemies are trying to kill him. And he's escaping. So they decided to return through Macedonia. Now we're going to get a bunch of names, some of which we may have heard before and some not. Because Luke is going to tell us people that are traveling with Paul. So Paul isn't solo in most of these journeys. And here we get evidence of that. So verse 4, Sopater the Berean. So remember, Berea was one of the cities that Paul visited and worked in. That's up in the north of Greece. Sopater the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, another city, right, that he had been to, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe. Now, do you remember where Derbe was? What journey do we learn about Derbe? I have to go back a ways. On that very first missionary journey, when Paul went up into Galatia, there were 4 cities, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, that he went to in sort of an arc. And one after the other, he preached the gospel in each one. Then he went back through them and came back, and that was the end of journey 1. So now he's mentioned 2 cities in Greece here, Berea and Thessalonica, and now this Gaius of Derbe, that's in Galatia, and Timothy, and we know Timothy was from Galatia. He was from Lystra. So now got another guy from Galatia, and the Asians. So Asia is where Paul is. He's in Ephesus. He's in Asia. So do you see how there's the sort of guys from all the places he's been preaching as he's traveled? From Galatia, from Asia, from Greece, North and South Greece. You got guys from each of those places traveling with him now. And Luke takes time to name them and where they're from. And we might wonder, why does Luke do that, and why is Luke traveling? Why is Paul traveling with this group? I thought we might open a couple of passages to connect some other things concerning this. So if you go to Romans for a minute, Romans chapter 15. So I'm going to ask a really silly question. In the book of Romans, who is Paul writing to? The Romans, okay, right? The church in Rome. Okay? Paul writes that letter right here where we read in Acts, where he went down to South Greece, when he went to Corinth. That's when he wrote the letter to the Romans. The second visit to Corinth. Now, I could go through all the reasons we know that to be the case. I won't bore you with that, but trust me, he fired off the letter to Rome from Corinth. So look at what he says here in Romans 15, verse 22. To the Romans, he's writing. He says, "This is the reason why I have so often been hindered from coming to you." Paul's writing a letter to a church he never had been to. He didn't plant the church in Rome. He wanted to go, but he had never been there. He says, I've been prevented from coming to you. Okay? But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, again, where's Paul when he writes the Romans? We just said it, Corinth. So he feels like he's done working in that area. He's planted that church. He has visited it multiple times. And then we know he's written them probably 4 letters by the time he's done, because we have the 1st and 2nd Corinthians that we have, and then there's at least 2 other letters that he refers to in those letters that he wrote to Corinth that we don't have copies of. So he has focused a lot of energy in this area. He's planted the churches and he strengthened them. So he says, I no longer have room for work in these regions, and since I have longed for many years to come to you, Rome, I hope to see you in passing as I go to where? Spain. Now, Paul's intent is to go all the way to Spain, which, if you look at a map, Rome's way west, but Spain is even further west. Okay? That's his goal. And to be helped on my journey there by you, once I have enjoyed your company for a while. How does Paul plan to be able to get to Spain? With whose help? The Romans, right? So he hopes to come visit them, and then they're going to help him go to Spain, where he can preach the gospel there. Okay? At least that's his plan. Verse 25, at present, however, I am going to Jerusalem. Remember? His plan was to sail to Jerusalem from Corinth, sail back to Israel from Corinth. But that got waylaid because there was an assassination attempt or plot. So he went a different way. But he is planning on going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia, North and South Greece, have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. As Paul has been making this journey number 3, he has been making a collection in all these Gentile churches to take back to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem you have a bunch of Christians who were what religion before? They were Jews, Jewish Christians. Paul has been making a collection among Gentile Christians, and in this way he hopes, it seems, to bind the church together, to unite them. If the saints in Rome, in Jerusalem, seem to be struggling, there's been famines and so forth, they need help. What if he can bring a great contribution of aid from all the Gentile churches to the Jewish Christians? You see what his idea is. Let's help one another and bind us together, because they're naturally sort of at each other's throats, Jew and Gentile. All right, so this is what he's talking about as he writes to Rome, bringing a contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. For they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, that is, the spiritual blessings of Jewish Christians, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings. When therefore I have completed this and have delivered to them what has been collected, I will leave for Spain by way of you. So I'm going to come back, I'm going to finally get to visit you in Rome, and you're going to help me go to Spain. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the fullness of the blessing of Christ. So we have that, you sort of see Paul's goal. He wants to go to Rome, he wants to go to Spain. He's done with these areas in Greece. He's done his work there. All right, let's go one other place just to tie this together. 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Very famous passage, I think, to most of us. when we talk about what we do in worship, okay, or at least part of what we do in worship. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 1, Paul says to the current, who's he writing 1 Corinthians to? The Corinthians, right? The people in Corinth. I ask tough questions. Now concerning the collection for the saints. Now my whole life in the church, I've heard preachers say, here's why we take up a collection on Sunday. Okay, here's the example. Okay, and it's true. Okay, but I never really knew the background of this. Well, why was it originally said? Paul says to the Corinthians, concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. When do you do it? On the first day of the week. Each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. Remember, he's making this collection. He's going to take it back to the poor saints in Jerusalem. So here he's telling the Corinthian church, every week when you come together on the first day to worship, you need to lay by and store, that is, make an offering that you plan to make, so we don't have to do this all at once when I show up in Corinth. So it's ready. And then it will be taken to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I also should go, they will accompany me. So we did all that to figure out why there in Acts 20, Paul makes this long list of guys. If you count them up, there's seven names. 7 is that good, perfect whole number. There's 7 guys that are traveling with him. And why is that? They've got a lot of money that they've collected. And in those days, it wasn't checks. We understand? I mean, if you were carrying a bunch of money in that time, what are you carrying? Yeah, like coins, gold and silver coins. And I imagine it's a big amount. I mean, I doubt Paul's carrying it all in one big rucksack. He's got 7 guys, and there's probably more that aren't named, and they're carrying it together. There's also some security in that. I mean, if there's an assassination squad out for Paul, there's strength in numbers here as well. And so, we think, what do we got all these names here? Why is Luke giving us all these names to read over? Well, there's a reason. and some of these names will appear in some of Paul's letters later on. But so that gets us a little bit on this back. And these guys are coming from all these areas that Paul has been, where he's making this collection. So it's like representatives of all these Gentile churches, and they're going to take this offering to Jerusalem. Verse 5. These went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. If you look at your map, that's back on the Asian continent on the west coast, city of Troas. It's, I think we said this before when we first saw Troas, it's the ancient city of Troy. So if you study about Troy and some of the stuff that happened there, this is Troas in New Testament times. And apparently there's a church there. We haven't heard about a church there until now, but there's a church in Troas. They were waiting for us at Troas, but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. Does everybody's translation there in verse 6 say unleavened bread? Okay. What is that feast, the other word for that feast? Jewish feast. What feast do you have unleavened bread at in the Old Testament? Passover, right? So Passover feast. After the days of the Passover feast, we sailed away from Philippi, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. You see how detailed Luke is? It's like Took us this many days to get from here to there. Here's the people that we're traveling. Here are the cities we came to. It's like a good historian. And the rest of the book of Acts, the last 7 chapters or so, is really like a travel log when you read it. It's a lot of where they boarded ship and where they went and how long it took. More so than what we've seen so far. But they finally arrive in Troas. And there's one little detail here that Luke doesn't emphasize, other than when he says 5 days, it took 5 days to sail. That's a 2-day trip, 2-day sailing distance, even in that world. So what might that tell you about that voyage? A 2-day trip took 5. They hit some traffic on the high seas, probably bad weather. I mean, we could have, some of the shipwrecks and struggles on the seas that Paul talks about in other places may have been on this, because it was more than twice as long as it should have taken. When he says 5, that's an important detail. So we just assume, they sailed across and the sea was like glass, but no. There's dangers and threats all along. Verse 7, on the first day of the week. What day is that? First day of the week to us is Sunday. It was to them too. On the first day of the week, Sunday, in Troas, okay, when we were gathered together to do what? To break bread. Now, what does that mean? On the first day of the week when we were gathered together to break bread, to commune, most likely, and I think clearly here, that's a shorthand way of saying to commune, to take the Lord's Supper. Early on it seemed to be referred to as the breaking of bread. If you go read 1 Corinthians, whenever he refers to this, he talks about breaking bread. And remember, in the Gospels, when Jesus sort of institutes the supper, when the gospel writers talk about it, they say he blessed the bread and broke it. So it became known as sort of the breaking of bread. Not just eaten, okay, but this is the communion of the Lord's Day. First day of the week, they're gathered together to break bread. Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. Divine sanction for long sermons, right? All the way to midnight. Now, we don't know when they started the service, but even Luke says he prolonged his speech, so it's long. Even if, they came together sort of in the evening, it probably is what happened. It seems like the early Christians, a lot of times, they had Sunday evening service, not Sunday morning service, because so many of the early Christians basically worked as slaves and worked during the day. And so for them to be able to worship, they would have come together after the workday was over. Does that make sense? And it seems like, at least early on, a lot of times they met for worship in the evening. Otherwise, you'd have to meet almost before day broke in the morning. So, even if they come together at 6 or so, and then all the way to midnight, he preaches without PowerPoint and everything. Prolonged his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered. Now, when we suddenly start seeing the word "we," what does that tell us? Acts scholars. Luke. Now, Luke's back with them. He hadn't been with them for a while if you've been reading. But now Luke's back in the group. He's joined them. So he's seeing this. What, by the way, what profession was Luke? position. Now, that might come into play here. There are many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. Now, a smart aleck might say, divine sanction for falling asleep during a sermon, right? I won't say that, but being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story. So they're in a big building, and it seems like a lot of the buildings in that world in the first century, the larger rooms were at the top. So a large room to accommodate the church or this gathering, and they're up there, open windows, okay? He falls out after he fell asleep and was taken up dead. So he falls to his death. 3 stories. Anybody know what Eutychus' name means? It's sort of ironic. Lucky. Somebody say lucky? Lucky. Fortunate or lucky. Doesn't seem very lucky here, but that is what his name means. Except maybe we'd say he was lucky that Paul was there. Although we would say more properly he was blessed. Falls to his death, verse 10, but Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms said, "Don't be alarmed, his life is in him." So Paul revives him, resurrects him through the power of God. The language is very clear that he didn't just sort of knock himself out in this fall. There in verse 9, the language is very clear. He died. And then Paul, as people are sort of panicked, and he's leaning over him, says his life is restored in essence. His life is in him by the power of God. Interesting that a physician is recording this story. And then we sort of leave Eutychus. Verse 11, when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, now they seem to be eating, not just eating Lord's Supper. He conversed with them a long while until daybreak. He's preached to midnight, now he preaches till 6 a.m. And so departed. And they took the youth away alive and were not a little comforted. In other words, they were very comforted. Fascinating story of Eutychus. And I've always wondered, why include this? I guess we could just say, Spirit told Luke to include it. But he's been telling the story of them moving, sailing from here to there, and we've got a church service in Troas. Maybe your answer would be, well, it happened. So you include it, but weren't there a lot of things that happened that weren't included in the story? It's interesting that this is included, but not in great detail, and we never hear of Eutychus again. But this event took place here in Troas. This, in verse 7, is the first time that we have reference to the church worshiping on the first day of the week in Acts. Here in Acts 27, we were gathered together to break bread. It's the first clear reference to the church worshiping on the first day. Important verse. Okay, questions or comments on that? Yes, Landon?
Is there any different word used that would help us understand that in verse
Well, in verse 7, all it says is gathered to break bread. In verse 11, they broke bread and ate. So it's that "and ate," which makes us believe maybe now they're sharing a meal, although it's a strange time to us to be sharing a meal. And we wouldn't think that they would be taking the Lord's Supper twice in the same gathering. That's the general thinking. But just that extra word, and ate. Others? Don?
Yeah, back to verse 7, your question of what day of the week it is called the first day, because Jews did not have a name except for Sabbath or Sabbath, which they call Saturday. The Romans had an 8-day week, which they didn't adapt to 7 days until later, first, second century, I think. So when we say first day, it's literally the first day of the week after the Shabbat, which would be our Sunday.
Right. And just to remind ourselves, why would that be a natural day to gather to worship for Christians? What happened on the first day of the week? Jesus raised. Okay? So you come together on Resurrection Day to worship the one who was raised. And it seems, by all accounts, to be what happened early on and continued from that point. Other questions, comments? Okay, going on here, verse 13. But going ahead to the ship, we set sail for Assos, intending to take Paul aboard there, for so he had arranged, intending himself to go by land. So, okay, if you look at your map, you have Troas, and then it seems like real close, this next city, Assos. There's actually like a peninsula in between these two cities, and it's about 20 miles from one to the other. So, it takes a good walker can do that in a day, right? It actually took longer to sail, probably, but Paul says, you guys, you're sailing, I'm walking. Now that seems like a small detail, but that's interesting to me. He just preached like for 12 hours. He could get in a ship and do like the Lord did, take a nap. But he takes a day's walk. Now, we don't know why, but I'd love to hear possibilities. Why do you think Paul would walk and the rest of them sail? Do you have any opinion on that?
Is he still carrying all the money, the gift that goes?
Well, they're carrying it. Well, I don't know exactly in whose possession it is, but I figure it would take more than one person.
He would be able to put all that on the boat, because it would probably sink.
Yeah, I don't know. Apparently they got a boat big enough to haul it, but yeah, I don't. But remember, there's people after him. And so it might be natural to think that he sent it with others. I don't know. Sharon?
If he wanted to be by himself, then
Why? Why would a preacher want to be by himself?
he had just given all that energy and that himself and preaching, and he needed some time with the Lord by himself.
Okay. We don't know, but that makes sense. Time to pray? Huh?
Why you take Monday off, right?
Oh, yeah. Some Mondays, yeah. I don't walk 20 miles, though. I guarantee you that. I've walked 20 miles once in my life, and I was probably about 12 when that happened. That took all day long. I just thought it was interesting. You can read over this real quick, but it's a little puzzling at first sight. They're going to sail, he's walking to the next town. And then he's going to sail with them after that. But He went by land. Verse 14, and when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and went to Mytilene, the next place down the road of the sea. Again, if you look at your map, they're on the edge of Asia, and there's all these islands that dot the edge, and they're going to hit several of them as they're traveling. And it seems like any place there's a port, they stop, and then they go again the next day. So it might have to do with the weather at this time of year. It's not the best in the Mediterranean at this time of year, but he keeps mentioning these places. So they went to Mytilene, and sailing from there, we came the following day opposite Chios. The next day we touched at Samos, and the day after that we went to Miletus. So you see how it's just naming place after place that they stop, ports of call. And then Luke says, for Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus. That's the next one coming. He's going to go past it, though. He's not stopping there. So that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hastening to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. Why is Paul avoiding Ephesus? Might be a lot of reasons you could think of. He's had some trouble there, right? Okay. But what also is, he spent a lot of time there, didn't he? Like 3.5 years. You think he was close with the church there? If he stops at Ephesus, he's going to be delayed. Okay? And so he's trying to get back to Jerusalem by Pentecost. And he doesn't want to get stuck at Ephesus for whatever reason, whether danger or just the brethren aren't going to want to see him. Hey, Paul, can you preach a meeting for us while you're in town? That kind of thing, or whatever it is. He avoids Ephesus on this sailing trip. Wanted to be in Jerusalem by Pentecost. So, yes?
Did he already have his tearful goodbye with the elders?
It's coming up next.
Oh, okay.
Yes, very next thing.
He goes back to Ephesus.
No, they come to him.
Oh, okay.
That's what we'll see here. Good call on that.
Maybe that was why he didn't go do that again.
Yeah, I think there's something about actually physically being in Ephesus he doesn't want to do at this time, whether it's, he just feels it'll be delayed by something. But again, Pentecost. So a little while earlier he mentioned unleavened bread, Passover. Okay, now he says, I want to get to Jerusalem by Pentecost. That word Pentecost, what does that mean? 50th. Okay, so a little Jewish calendar stuff here. Feast of Pentecost, or Feast of Passover, 50 days later is Pentecost. So remember, he had just been in a place and they observed Passover. Then he has 50 days to get back to Jerusalem. He wants to be there by Pentecost because that's one of the great times when people come into Jerusalem. It's a pilgrimage festival. They come in. It's a good time to be there and maybe get to preach. And there's more people there, Jews there, that will get to see this gift that they're bringing from the Gentile churches. Right? And he's trying to unite the church. So he wants to get there by Pentecost. He's hastening to be at Jerusalem by then. So that sort of gives us a time frame. Now, verse 17, from Miletus, he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church to come to him. So he sailed past it, and now he sends a word. How did he do that? I wonder. He's got to send messenger back, right? So it's at least a day to send a messenger to get the people, and then a day to travel back. This stuff doesn't happen quick, like we're used to. Sends from Miletus to Ephesus to call the elders of the church to come to him, and when they came to him, he spoke to them. So now he's called the elders from Ephesus to come to meet him here at Miletus before he goes back to Israel, to Jerusalem. And we don't have time to go through his speech here, but it's interesting. One interesting thing that happens is the group that he called here in verse 17 are called what? Elders, right? He calls the elders of the church. If you look on later in verse 28, Paul is speaking to them, and he calls them something different there. Shepherds, a little bit. Overseers. So and that's the word episkopos. So he calls them elders here at the beginning, and then the same group he calls overseers in verse 28, and then as someone else pointed out, he talks about them in terms of being shepherds. So you have three terms for church leaders, and it's all referring to the same group of guys from Ephesus. All three terms referring to the same group. So there's no difference between elders, overseers, and shepherds. Okay, it's all the same group, just three different ways of describing them here. And notice it all in the plural, right? He didn't send for the pastor of the church of Ephesus. He sent for the elders, overseers, shepherds, pastors of the church to come. And then he speaks to them here. It's a very interesting lesson. It's the only speech in Acts devoted or directed to an exclusively Christian audience. And that's what we'll pick up with next week. Okay? All right. Thank you all. Beware of falling asleep near an open window, unless you're lucky.